Thank you for joining for this evening's Dharma talk. As always, we sincerely appreciate all the support that you offer us, both financially and through your presence. And if you are able to continue in either way, please do. It means a great deal to have this group meeting on a daily basis to practice the Dharma together. So thank you for being here. I often feel like a trap has been set when I come up to give a Dharma talk. And what's interesting is like the best predators, by the time you think a trap has been set, you're already stuck. And so it's kind of useless to think you're in the trap. I'm already caught in the web. Sokuzan asked me to talk about something this evening that I'd rather not talk about. Perhaps I just don't want to talk at all, but he's asked me to, and I will endeavor to do my best. And he's asked me to talk about the challenges of working with a teacher. See if anyone reacts to that. It's very difficult to talk about that aspect of the path. And one that I feel the seduction is to try to justify everything that comes into our lives. We start to actually modify our world and our experience to make it more palatable. So in working with the teacher, for some people, there's this honeymoon period at the beginning. Some of you are still in the honeymoon period. Just this powerful personality. I'm talking about Sokuzan right now. Let's not third party it. Powerful personality. Doesn't really teach like anybody else. We've heard a lot of Dharma teachers, and they all sound very similar, and they're very sincere. They are very kind. They are helping people. I am not at all in a position to invalidate anyone's teaching, but it would also be foolish to say that the way Sokuzan teaches is not unique. So there's something energizing about that. It's great. And I had my own honeymoon period with Sokuzan. What's interesting to me, it was like that opposite honeymoon, that from day one, there was tension, there was conflict. It was pretty subtle, but it was there for me mostly. He was always very sweet, very kind. And I spent a few years finding myself in front of Sokuzan. Some of you have heard this story. I was in college, and instead of going to a party on the weekend, I was driving to SokukoJi, an hour and a half south, to meditate all day. Or instead of going home for Christmas break, I'd come over here and spend a few days sitting sesshin with this very loud figure, Sokuzan. And after one of our retreats, we went to this wonderful pizza place in Grand Rapids called Brick Road Pizza. And anyone who's lived in Grand Rapids, it's gone now, knew this wonderful pizza place. And I remember I was 21 years old, and here's this, he was probably 68, 69 at the time, very loud figure holding the attention, not of just of the people at our table, but the entire room knew Sokuzan was in Brick Road Pizza. And that was threatening to me. There was something about that as somebody who prefers to go a little bit more unseen. And I kept showing up. And eventually I asked Sokuzan, I said, I'm graduating from college. I'm thinking about moving to a monastery for a year to practice meditation. I was struggling a tremendous amount emotionally. I really was having trouble functioning on a basic level. He said, well, why don't you move to SokukoJi? And there should have been all sorts of red flags. Here's somebody I don't consider my teacher. There was no residential program. And so logically, I said, that sounds great. And so two weeks after I got my diploma and walked across the stage, I was very close friends with Junshu. I was like, wow, I'm leaving for the monastery. I don't know what that was like for you. Maybe a bit surprising, was it? Maybe not, but moved to SokukoJi. Met with Unyo, who was Priscilla, and I met with Sokuzan, who was Bob, and the rules were laid down. We would sit 6.5 hours a day. was to no longer call him Bob, but either teacher or Sokuzan. It was no longer to call her Priscilla, but to start calling her Unyo. And I had to start wearing this silly jacket. I hate uniforms. Hate them. I quit Boy Scouts for no other reason than I was refused to wear a kerchief or whatever they're called. Loved being outside. And I was with Sokuzan a lot. I was with him every day and learning in a pretty unconventional way, no curriculum, just asking questions, being around him. And they were always very antagonizing. Always, I was not nearly as mature as Shan Yu. Shan Yu, are you 24 now? 23, 24, yeah. My questions were antagonistic, and we were sitting in White Tara, and at the time we were carving the sign that was out in front. It says SokukoJi Buddhist Temple. Sokuzan was teaching us how to carve it. So there's red rouge all over the wall, and there's this like particle board 8-foot table in there, and I'm bugging him. I'm not bugging him, but I'm like, are you awake? So are you enlightened? Are you saying you're enlightened? And it's, to me, similar in that is when I feel like the teaching started, because he smashed his fist on the table and let out this giant roar. And it wasn't funny. It was very painful. I just started crying, just crying, crying, and just he starts laughing and laughing. And I recognized my teacher, without a doubt. But it's never gone through the beautiful honeymoon phase that so many of you get to enjoy. And the difficulty about being a student is not being in charge. And that many of us can traverse the spiritual path for years, perhaps our entire lifetime. And we can do so in such a way that's very comfortable because we have a way to filter the teachings. We are the sole director, conductor of what we study, how we interpret it, what we remember. And when we don't like one particular meditation group, we go to the next. But when you take on a teacher, something is threatened because we are not traversing solely a path of reason, of logic. Hitting a table is not a logical thing to do. Your college professor probably did not hit the table, or your high school professor or your teacher. And so while it would be easy to try to go into this narrative that we want to relax into, which is everything is a teaching. Everything is a teaching. Hear everyone repeating that these days. Everything is a teaching. And in a sense, to me, it disrespects the teaching that is occurring. To regurgitate something the teacher has said simply because the teacher has said it, and to take it as our own. But sometimes we can't help but do that because the teachings are so intense, they're so painful. We have to justify why this activity is showing up this way. And the teacher is pounding his fist and pointing his finger and scolding. And so we consider it. We should not abandon everything as a teaching. I'm not saying that at all, but don't use that as a way to buffer the experience of our world. That the rawness is there to be seen. And the quality of abrasion or the perceived threat is there to be seen. And to remind ourselves it's a teaching is not a problem. It's actually very supportive to try to bring our world into the context of the path. But when it becomes habituated, when it becomes an automatic response, it's a form of ignorance. Anytime we take the teachings and we repeat them so we don't have to feel our world, we don't have to taste or smell or hear or touch or see or feel or think, in a sense, we abandon the teachings. This is classical. You could go to Yan had his admonitions and Shan had his admonitions. And oftentimes one of those admonitions is not to repeat something just because you've heard it. The Buddha said it in the Kalama Sutta, don't believe something just because it's been passed down. But that doesn't mean we can't use it to help us look more deeply at it. So everything is a teaching, but it can't be limited to one source. You start with the teacher. It may intimidate or threaten our sense of stability or security. But if that point does not allow us to look up and out into the world, then we create a form of idolatry. So the teacher represents the world. The Sangha represents the world. The Dharma introduces us to the world, and we should start at a fine point, something that's simple, something that's direct, something that's tangible. The teacher, the teachings, the physical, and I include the virtual as physical Sangha because we can see each other, we can hear each other. But everything we receive, you could say is preparing us to lift our gaze to the rest of the world. And it's unpleasant to see that our little world is not separate from the larger world. That this is an introduction to the world. We say, I want to be with all things, but we don't want to consider being with the actual all things. We just want to think about the world. But here is the representation of conflict, of dissatisfaction, of preferences that we see on TV and we hear on the radio and we see in the streets. So we have an opportunity to not just relate to the world, but to relate to the intense grasping at how we would like things to be. And that's challenging. So the challenge of working with the teacher is that that does not get to remain a special, isolated, cloistered relationship, but takes on the quality of our mind and takes on the quality of the world. So as students, I think it's really important to look at what are the most functional things we can do instead of abstracting and philosophizing about the nature of this relationship. How is it that we can begin to have a willingness to have the vulnerability to relate to our own mind without walls? In the form of the teacher, in the form of the Dharma, in the form of our life as it arises around us. And it is not enough to enact an idea around it, but it's helpful to have some ideas around it. It's not enough to say everything is a teaching, but it's helpful to consider what something is pointing out. This idea of rawness is something we can flash on, because as the stories become more seductive and more elaborate and more justifiable, there's still a raw threat that we feel, a raw nerve that's being touched. And so after everything's congealed into a story of enemies and allies, just like we could flash onto our senses, we could flash into the sense of touch, we could flash into just the rawness, because it's rare for it not to have some sort of visceral, experiential quality. And it's that point, that experience, that sensation, then can help us remember our intention to see through the nature of this constructed identity. That, as I've said before, somebody else's confusion is not an excuse for us to have our confusion. No situation, no matter how outlandish, justifies us turning away from looking at our own misunderstandings. It's not a call to apathy or indifference or inaction, but it's just that thought that in the midst of the convincing melodrama of our life, there's still an unexamined situation arising moment by moment right here. The teacher triggers that. The teacher embodies that. The teacher expresses that. The Sangha triggers that, embodies that, expresses that. And so I often come back to this exchange between the Zen master Kuei-shan and his student Yang-shan, and Yang-shan saying to Kuei-shan, in temporal matters, how should I act? And Kuei-shan responding, I don't tell you how to act, I just tell you to see clearly. So it's not a matter of modifying our expressions. It's not a matter of modifying our conduct. You may find it softening. You may find yourself a little more tentative to pull the trigger. But what is most important is to see clearly. And the opportunity to see clearly is present in every situation where we want to attribute this, that, good, bad. And so it's easy to say, it sounds good, sounds nice, but our practice is in the midst of it actually arising in a very personal way, to have a willingness to at least flash on the intensity of what appears to be me and what is threatened. For me, at least, sometimes permission to be confused. It's a little bit of permission to not know, to be in the midst of a very powerful mandala and not be able to justify anything, that I can't really understand what's happening. And that's, to me, a form of intimacy I've not experienced yet. And it's threatening. It's threatening to have the sort of intimacy of not knowing. It's another one of those sayings, those early Zen masters, not knowing is most intimate. And that actual experience of that initially is anything but pleasant. It's not as beautiful as when Fa Yan was told that. So we can not know, and we can continue. We can look at what is arising for ourselves and utilize this container, if for nothing else, to not abandon anything that shows up in our experience, in our consciousness, in our sense fields. And in doing so, perhaps support one another also in looking at those aspects of our neurotic tendencies, our preferences, our needs to move in and out of the situation. I know there's a tremendous more I could go into, but it's not showing up real clearly at this point. Any questions I might be able to respond to? Unyo.
Bowing. Today was kind of a different sort of day. Were you challenged by the teacher today, Bowing?
It's not a day where I am not challenged by a teacher.
Bowing. Was this unusual?
For me, and this is a lot of subjectivity, no. No, it did not stand out. I don't know what others experience with Sokuzana's day to day, but I have been told that the heat has been turned up on me, and that is not new. So today was not particularly shocking to me.
So with the teacher, do we have expectations of, or a standard of behavior that we feel they should, and particularly Sokuzan, since he's our teacher, should abide by?
Yes.
So how is a challenge by the teacher? How can we break through our own ignorance by seeing what may appear as a challenge as a teaching?
It's so personal, and in as far as you can, don't go in either direction. That being said, I do it all the time. These are the two directions we do go into, mostly. This is illogical, this is unkind, this is belligerent, this can't happen. There are rules. But the other side we go into is not wanting to feel it. So creating the story of almost a celestial experience of teaching. The not knowing is so threatening. The not knowing is so threatening. To not know, to have the authority, the confidence, the willingness to take our seat in the midst of not knowing is often too much. So we go into one of those stories, and all we can do from there is just be aware of it. So we can't modify how our thoughts take a life of their own and kind of create this elaborate context for everything. It's not just the teacher, it's our entire world. It's our politics, our relationships, our family, our jobs. So to just try to see as clearly as possible how elaborate the narrative becomes in every situation so that our world becomes more palatable temporarily, so that we feel more relatively confident that we can navigate it because at least I can call it this or call it that. And so when I come back to that teaching from Fa Yan, when his teacher says not knowing is most intimate, I was immediately struck by that. But it has a whole new resonance because the actuality of beginning to not know is absolutely threatening. It's absolutely threatening. We want to be able to look up at some people and look down at some people and look to the left and look to the right at some people. I've been reading the historical stories of the first bhikkhunis, and that was one of the admonitions the Buddha gave was stop evaluating yourself in the context of those above you and those below you and those next to you. So taking any direction and trying to find identity or locality. We have to come back to some sort of expression of the path. And so we do have a mindset of to work with it, to receive it as a teaching, but just not to fixate on that so much where it starts to cover up the actual rawness of not knowing or the rawness of just receiving the experience as it arises without justifying it.
Bowing. So when SokukoJi came in today, quite fired up, because there were some tasks that weren't being completed. He right away said he was going to do the vacuuming, and so started searching for a vacuum. And at some point, I wasn't there, but I understand you took over. I don't know if it was the vacuuming or at what point it was, but how is it that's when do we know to take over from a task like that the abbot is doing?
SokukoJi came into the monastery today, and Samu wasn't done. There was a lot of cleaning that hadn't been done. And it was, he came in very strong and was very upset that there was no one around to do the basic cleaning. So he said at 83 that he was going to do all of it himself. And so he got the vacuum, and I was watching him, and I saw that he wasn't sure how to turn it on. So I took it and turned it on, and I just didn't give it back to him. That's not a correct action, nor an incorrect action. And so our functioning is not defined based on what we do. Although in that situation, it was very clear I wasn't going to ask for SokukoJi's direction or permission in that very small menial situation of vacuuming, of cleaning rooms, of mopping. And there's no way to justify that. Had he came back and said, give that back to me, or I'm going to do it, get out, I might have, but he didn't. So I vacuumed. It was perhaps disappointingly simple. It wasn't a complicated thing with a lot of conversation and thought around it.
Bowing, one last one. Was there any humor at all in the hour and a half that was spent in that various tasks that we're doing?
A little bit.
When did it show up for you?
It didn't show up as like an event. It was really outlandish. I want to be clear too. It's not humor in that something was funny, but there was humor when I went to tell Chiezan I was leaving, and I wish he was in here so I could watch his expression. But he unlocked the hojo. There was something about that. My teacher was locked in the hojo by himself. There was something about that that just struck me as not funny. He was locked in the hojo. I don't know what that was about. His way of moving was pretty outlandish, pretty outrageous. And there's something that's a little bit comical, not comical, but there's some humor in that too. It was also very irritating. I won't pretend like it was this light event.
Doing your vow, and I said I had one last question, but I'll say I have another last question.
You and everyone else in the Sangha.
So what is the responsibility of the Sangha in a situation like that when the teacher seems very adamant about doing certain things himself? When do we know to step in? You said not knowing. You used not knowing and the same line that you used the word confused.
I would
Permission to not know, but to be confused.
say that this is a really tender area for any one of us. And what I would not feel comfortable is saying anything about how we should navigate that. But the situation arose, and instead of being prepared with the response for in the future, how much do we miss because of the knee-jerk impulse of our conditioning to perform a function in a certain way? There's no way to navigate that. There's no way to prepare yourself for any given situation. The only preparation I know of is the one where we look at the impulses of our mind and see how we are not living, we are being lived by this fear and this conditioning that seems to permeate almost all of our decisions. It's not to say there aren't functional ways to relate to situations or what we need to do, but the whole idea of these teachings is that we have a type of intimacy that isn't responding with, well, if A happens, then we respond with B. And then if B happens, we actually need to find a little bit of C and D. That there's no openness, there's no spaciousness, there's no humor in that sense. So if we go to the Heart Sutra and we talk about without walls of the mind, without walls of the mind, there is no reference point to premeditate our response out of. There is no standard that can be applied universally, and yet we may utilize what is around us. So
the great refuge. When what arises in the mind appears as something that's aggressive, or when everything that's arising appears to be somewhat of the poisons, and there's a paralysis that remains, you who have been a functionary for many years, how do you respond in a situation where everything appears to be a knee-jerk reaction or a paralysis of fear?
I don't know, but what you're describing, there's not an antidote activity to that. So to me, it comes back to that willingness to look at it. So you see the impulse of fear, you see the knee-jerk reaction, and we continue that line of confusion by trying to look for an alternative, look for the resolution of that. If we're not clear about that, if we can't see, SokukoJi said, see the grasping, if we can't see the grasping, any attempt to catch ourselves, like I said at the beginning, you're already in the trap and you think you're going to save yourself. You've already locked down on what it is. You've not seen that, and then you want to go further and add to that confusion. And so again, it comes back to that willingness to be confused a little bit, to have a little bit of softness around our confusion. I don't know how to do that as a practice necessarily, other than seeing how painful it is. Milka.
Milk bowing. Several times you said something is triggered, embodied, and then expressed. I think if we're facing a difficult situation and something is triggered, in the embodiment and expression, does something change if we're aware of what's happening?
I think that what you're asking is a really valid question. And I apologize for my shortcoming in responding to it, but I feel like that takes us so far away from the initial situation. That does our awareness modify the way we embody or express something? I would say probably. But again, if we have not seen the first impulse, if we've not seen the rawness of it, any speculation around the expression of it takes us away from that not knowing. And I feel I don't know how to talk about going into that area because it is threatening. We really want to just we want to stay on the surface of what we can perceive and what we can manipulate. That's how we often approach the path, is how can I execute the path? How can I rearrange phenomena to support me on the path? How can I modify an expression to create an alternative result? And I don't think there's any other way to start the path but to continue to remind ourselves that, to me, Buddhism is a simple path, in the sense it's just asking us to be with what shows up. It's simple in that it's not an accumulation or a heavy training of reconditioning ourselves. It's the intimacy of the rawness of our experience, the experiencer, the perceived experience. And again, I'm sure there's ways to talk about that others would be more qualified to talk about. But as somebody who's practicing with you, or practicing with you, the teaching I've received is the very thing that's showing up is what is needing to be related to. And it doesn't require any modification, although standards may say it needs to be modified. And it also, again, doesn't mean some sort of indifference or apathy or inactivity. It's very confusing.
Yoga bowing. It was the relating without modification.
Again, it may not be something we can do. It's probably we're going to modify things a great deal. But shikantaza, I use that as the example. I don't think shikantaza is an isolated practice. Just like everything else, I feel like shikantaza is the embodiment of the entire world. It's an expression of the entire phenomenal world. And shikantaza is a practice that does not require modification. The slight modification we make is to the body, to taking the posture. But even though we do modify, we are continuously reminded that we don't need to change what we see, smell, hear, taste, touch, or think. That those expressions which arise spontaneously in no way can interrupt or obstruct the simple practice we're being taught. So the not needing to modify is acknowledging that any given situation is the product of so many things coming together, so many variables coming together, that the idea of modifying it almost becomes silly a little bit. Again, we're not saying you don't remove yourself from a situation. We're not saying that you don't speak up or say something, but we're not doing it with this grand scheme of thinking that we're going to get control of our world. We create artificial stability. A monastery is artificial stability. It's temporary stability so that we have enough structure to do this practice that is very difficult.
You know, combining. Do we need to see anything more than the interruption that shows up with the rawness?
We may, but I don't know that we need to go looking for it. So again, do we need to see anything more than the disruption? If you recognize a disruption, if it's showing up, that's what we look at, but don't start like peeping your head around trying to find the next thing to occur. What is that obstructing? Is there something that I'm missing? That kind of impulse is part of kind of what keeps fueling this. So it doesn't have to be clarity that we would recognize, but it also doesn't require us to try to clarify it. You just look at it if it looks muddy or if it looks clear, or if it shifts between the two.
Thank you.
Jinshu.
Junshu bowing. Watching the situation today with SokukoJi coming in to do some was uncomfortable and brought up a lot of self-consciousness.
Yes.
It felt like I pretty immediately just covered that up and came to sit. So it felt like, or feels like that area is inaccessible because it was just shut off quickly. Is there a way to, or even a need to somehow go back into that to see what was being triggered?
You might in like Dokusan, but again, it seems like you're describing something very crisply, and again, I have to acknowledge my own subjectivity, and this is in working with my own mind. It's like it's so easy to look back and see how could I have done that differently, or how could I do it differently in the future, and the idea is that you could have done it differently. And you couldn't have, because you did it the way you did it, expressed the way it expressed, and you watched that progression. You watched as you maybe dove undercover and you pop back up in the Zendo, and then you start to have second thoughts, and all of that to me is what's being pointed at. We're not being pointed at something as an alternative to that. Like, how do I not be that sort of person? How do I be a different sort of person? And I think that's part of what is difficult about the path, is having to see those tendencies that maybe don't feel so supportive. And so again, to come back to your question, going into it, you might do so in a very clear container like Dokusan, but you also might have an appreciation for watching how that, progressed through your afternoon.
Junshu bowing. The experience of not knowing is at least theoretically supported here in this context. When we have that feeling, say at work, in a situation where it's not as culturally supported or supported, how can we stay with it or not cover it up?
I would say it's okay to know. a little bit. You know, at work, it's okay to know what needs to be done or have, they call standard operating procedures. I know there's a lot of those at your work, how to do things correctly. And that's not a problem. So the not knowing we're talking about is not just the absence of something. The not knowing can absolutely be there in the midst of very confident, certain logic. To me, it has to do with the relationship. How much do we depend on the reliability of that logic? How much do we demand that to maintain or continue to be the case to support our functioning? So not knowing could be doing your job very confidently, but having a willingness to see it for what it is, which is just a functional aspect of what you have to do on a day-to-day basis. And when the whims of your bosses change, then they change. And so maybe that's where the not knowing comes in.
Aren't you bowing? Alistair.
SokukoJi's been wanting me to thread this into one of my talks for some time, and I've not found a way to do it. And I just want to express that this is not something I'm trying to conceptually express to you, that these are all things that I relate to on a day-to-day basis. And again, there's no smooth way to weave this in, but he's been asking me to. But a few months ago, there was a conflict. There was an altercation between SokukoJi and I, perhaps between myself and myself, I don't know, where I split his dining room table. Put my fist nearly through the tabletop, and he's refused to let me fix it. So every time I go to the house, I can feel where the wood's split in half. And you know, if we're looking at not telling one how to act, we have to have clarity around our confusion. We have to have a willingness to see that some of those causes and conditions may need to come to fruition, but we can't justify it. We don't justify our expressions of confusion. We don't justify them. They may need to arise. And so it's just coming back to, we have to work with the human experience. We have to work with the raw material. And that is a lot of it's very far beyond what we have a say-so over. And what we do seem to have a say-so over is to look at those raw aspects of our experience and try to relate to them in a way that allows us to see more clearly how we just keep getting pulled into our emotions, pulled into our feelings, pulled into our impulses. So endeavoring to not become a good student, not become an obedient student, but to become a student who has the willingness to look at the dirty qualities and not necessarily hide from them, but not necessarily feel like we need to be constantly projecting them. It's that kind of that middle way. It's not an austerity, it's not an ascetic practice where we pretend like we have no negativity, and it's not the complete indulgence of just being belligerent about whatever impulses arise. So if we can utilize our experience to look at that, it seems important. Jishin?
Jishin bowing. Is it possible to stay with that rawness that you are talking about tonight? It seems to me that it is somehow similar to the instruction of not to add, which SokukoJi admits that it's impossible. Bowing.
There's no need to maintain anything. Don't stay with anything. Don't stay with the rawness. And maybe I've even said that. I wouldn't argue with anyone who said I said that. But to amend it, you don't need to stay with it. There's nothing to maintain, but you could flash on the rawness. You could acknowledge the rawness and just watch how things of their own start to try to smooth themselves over. That's that cycle of passion, aggression, and ignorance. And the aggression, the outburst, the passion, trying to smooth it over in the ignorance of thinking everything's okay now so that we can restart the cycle. So the rawness is something as it shows up, we look at it, we can flash on it, we can just like the other senses, but doesn't need to be maintained.
Thank you. Perhaps you explain what that rawness is, but I didn't get it. If you could somehow describe what that rawness actually is.
I think we all experience of that probably, and the way I'm talking about it, and I'm sure it could be talked about differently, is it's that underlying experience that is not defined by the concepts. And I don't know, maybe when we lose a loved one, like someone we're very close with, there can be a rawness because there's no real thoughts around it. There's no real story about why we feel that way. There's just something very visceral. There's something very visceral about it. And so any given situation that may trigger our response, it's easy for it to spiral into the thoughts about it. But in the midst of it, you may actually be able to flash on your body. You could actually maybe see if it's showing up as a tightness in the chest or a turning in the stomach or a heat in the forehead. So it's probably very individual, but I often notice that in the midst of my own mental productions, there is a strong sensation. There is a strong sensation that underpins that.
Chiezan, would you say that this is something which happens before we start adding? Bowing?
I don't know, it may start before, but we've also talked ourselves into all sorts of rawness. Like it's like everything's going fine, and then we just start on a thought, and then that starts to snowball, and all of a sudden we're consumed by emotion. So I don't think it has to work in one particular way, but oftentimes when something shocks us or startles us or functions out of our expectations, outside of our expectations, it may start out more visceral and then develop into, you know, we did something terrible or someone else did something terrible, but can certainly work the other way as well.
Thank you.
So bowing, there's conventionally talk of losing control, and that can be compared with restraining oneself. In the example of you hitting the table, did any of that show up? What was the experience of that bowing?
This part is funny. Because initially there was, because, and Sokuzan saw this, I went to bring my fist down and then I saw my glasses. And so there wasn't a thought about it, but there was some sort of restraint of not wanting to smash my glasses. That's quite fuzzy, so I don't know if I composed myself for a moment before I was outbursting again. So I don't remember if I kept from hitting my glasses and then hit, or I kept from hitting my glasses, composed myself, and then things continued to devolve and I hit the table.
So bowing, you said kept from, as though it was a restraint. I don't understand.
I don't either. All I can say is keep a pair of glasses on the table and see what happens if that happens to be below your fist. I mean, it was a flash, but it was enough. There was no thought, but there was enough sense of not wanting to put my fist through a pair of glasses.
So bowing, if sometimes it's that area of being able to function or express one's nature is interrupted by the conditioning of being appropriate, or conditioning of being polite. When we are strongly conditioned by our society to act in a certain way, what does it look like to be able to just function normally or express one's anger normally, etc.? Bowing.
it feels like the normalcy is not separate from your conditioning. So to try to counteract that and think that, oh, one who is very, very clear doesn't have to have any tact because they can just express themselves without interruption. I don't know. But so what you're describing, I don't see an activity as an antidote to that, of how you could be more direct or how you could be more precise or authoritative. I don't see that as the alternative. And if any activity needs to arise contrary to that conditioning, it's almost like you couldn't keep it in your mouth if you wanted to. You couldn't have kept it in your mouth if you had $1 million to keep it in your mouth. And so as practitioners, to continue to be willing to reside in the tension being that you notice yourself habitually acting a certain way and you find it distasteful. So there's this tension. You don't want to act that way. But to say, well, then I'm just going to express this. It's, in a sense, it's just another form of conditioning. So the tension itself helps us to see the positions more clearly. It's how it looks to me that tension is an indicator of the positions. Stand and dedicate the merit.
Hi, this is Chiezan, the prior at SokukoJi Buddhist Monastery. If you value these talks and would like them to continue, please visit our donate page at www.sokukoji.org. Thank you.